Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here and introducing this wonderful new series, The Architecture of Place, collaboration between the ICAA, INTBAU, and the Princess Foundation. This series of talks is a collaboration between these three organizations and focuses on the built environment and its impact on the health of individuals, communities, and the planet. Established and emerging voices will speak on their work to create a better built future, something we can all look forward to. Today's talk is entitled American Housing and Social Justice, Undoing the Lasting Legacy of Housing Segregation with Marianne Cusato. This talk will look at the history and lasting legacy of housing segregation in America, both intended and unintended. Beyond the past and present, Marianne will discuss potential ideas for addressing these inequities, specifically the nationwide affordable housing crisis, so we might build a stronger future for all communities. Our speaker, Marianne Cusato, is renowned for her work on innovative housing and solutions for disaster recovery and workforce housing. She is the partner in charge of design and development at Cypress Community Development Corporation, a not-for-profit housing company dedicated to creating resilient and energy-efficient homes that are also dignified and attainable. Marianne serves on the faculty at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. She is the author of two books, The Just Right Home, Buying, Renting, Moving, or Just Dreaming, Find Your Perfect Match, with Daniel DeClerico, and Get Your House Right, Architectural Elements to Use and Avoid, with Ben Pantreath, Richard Sammons, and Leon Creer, with a foreword by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Marianne Cusato.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone at the ICA. It is an honor to be with you here today, to be part of this series, and to talk about something which is really central to who we are as a nation. This topic is something that touches every aspect of where and how we exist in this country. I know we have an international audience today. This is very much an American talk, not to be nationalistic, but to be whole humans first before we can aspire to represent ourselves in the world. There are a lot of issues within how we have built our communities and how we live together that we need to address and we need to look at. Who we are is in question, and this is the time of really reckoning with that and looking inward and outward at the same time. I've put three foundational principles for this talk, combined all three together, say we can do better. We can't work and live in a society that doesn't work for everyone. It may seem like it's working well for few, many even, but when everyone is not included, we all lose. And that's something I'm going to lay out a framework here and show where we've come from, where we are, and hopefully where we're going. This talk, there will be four parts of it. We're going to raise awareness and recognize what has happened. Some of this you might know, some of it may be new to you, some of it may be uncomfortable. Demystify what affordable housing solutions look like and are, and then explore ways to look to the future. It's essential that all of these are looked at together. So it's not going to be a direct path. There's actually going to be a little weaving in and out, because the pieces that go together to tell this story and to explain where we are today build on events that have been growing and escalating for hundreds of years. And if we just look at where we are today and scratch our heads and say, how do we fix this problem, without looking back to understand how we got here, we're never truly actually going to be able to move past where we are today. So why am I giving this talk? If you're watching this as part of the ICA audience or the INTBAU or Princess Foundation, you may know of me from the top line here, which are the Katrina Cottage and Get Your House Right. So my background is disaster housing and a book about getting details right. And the premise of that book, Get Your House Right, was to look at communities and look at streets and say, well, why does one feel different than the other? How do we build a place that feels authentic and real? Very much in keeping with the mission of all three of those organizations that are hosting today. And that work which I'm most known for, has led to some other work, which I might not be as known for. I worked for a few years with James Hardy on an initiative called The Value of Design, where we actually worked on fighting exclusionary zoning. And that was built on the previous work of Get Your House Right. Why do some places feel better than others? And how do we stop codes from halting progress? Other work that I'm currently engaged in includes disaster rebuilding, continuing on the work at the Trina Cottage, in places where there is already an affordable housing crisis. So all of this mixes together. If you think back to the previous slide, which is sort of demystifying housing solutions and looking at where we go from here. So this summer, as everything was exploding with the George Floyd situation and a reckoning of social justice, as I started looking and saying, well, what can I do? The first step was to read as much as I could about this history and how we got to where we are. I'm interested in housing, so I started with the history of housing. And it led me to realize that all of that history has set the foundation for my work. That when I work for ending exclusionary zoning, I now realize where that came from and why. When I look at the housing crisis, I realize now the pieces that led to that. So I'm not a historian. I'm not going to proclaim to be. I'm going to put my professor hat on quite a bit in this talk and give you your homework assignments and your reading recommendations so we can all educate ourselves to what has happened. I read these with the lens of understanding where we are today and seeing how these events have contributed to that, and look at it now to unpack where we might go. So let's look at our history. Where did we come from? Here's your first reading assignment. This author, James W. Lowen, has written 2 books well into sundown towns and need to get why, as my teacher told me, but essentially is unpacking what's the history we don't know. How do we tell the same events and other events that have just been erased in a more inclusive way to share the voices of what has actually come? One of the things that was new to me was after the Civil War, that there were places in America that actually embraced minority communities. You can see here the anti-slavery celebration. There's discussion of whether the Civil War was fought for state rights or against slavery. And there's a pretty convincing body of knowledge saying that it was about ending slavery, and it very much was. But there's also the next chapter of that, which is discussing, well, what happened immediately after? And this is where we don't tell our history very well. We skip over what happened in the immediate aftermath. And there was actually a period of time where African Americans could own property, could participate fully in Northern and Western communities. We're actually part of the fabric of America. And this lasted, the Civil War ended in 1865. And up until around 1890, this was part of the fabric of the areas outside of the South. And if we had continued, if it had not stunted at that point, we would live in a very different world today. But systematically that changed. And this is where the James Lowen book, Sundown Towns, picks up and talks about the towns across America where they were after dark, whites only. You had to leave. You couldn't own property. Communities were driven out, sometimes because of a single event, sometimes because of no events. And entire communities were burned down and people pushed out. This continued on, and those that were champions for integration, people that fought with Black soldiers in the Civil War, that realized that we're one nation here, and the them and us sort of mentality, which had allowed slavery to exist. It allowed it to exist because you can own another person if you don't admit their humanity. And when soldiers fought side by side and saw the humanity and realized what we've been thinking has not been true, that allowed an integration. But quickly, Lowen talks about the 3 I's of the displacing Indians, massive immigration coming, and the imperialistic nature of the US going and taking Hawaii, taking these other communities, allowed that them and us to come back. And in around 1890, really became now part of the fabric of the nation, where we were saying anyone other than white Americans are other. And this is when the divide between what might have been up until 1890 and what has become took off. This was made worse after one movie and one book took off 1915, The Birth of a Nation, which depicted heroic Klansmen saving the damsel in distress from, of course, it was a blackface. They didn't even have black people in the movie. It was the worst sort of characterization. And it framed again this distance, this us and them, they are other, and therefore the fear is okay. And Gone with the Wind as well. All of this to set a tone. And the reason I'm going back to this point is to set the tone of fear, that we have allowed that fear to drive very destructive set of policies, behaviors, and tactics that have been pervasive. At the same time, and this is now 1915 to 1970, so a wide range here, we had a mass migration, 6 million Black Southerners leaving for better opportunity, leaving. Now, as they're leaving the South, they're hitting these sundown towns. The author, James Loewen, as he was writing the book, thought he would find a few hundred nationwide. He found a few hundred in the state of Illinois. I mean, this was pervasive. So now you have this mass migration of refugees, if you will, leaving and entering into other parts of the country, and doing so not allowed into rural areas, but focused into cities, the only place they were allowed. And if you think back, looking at elections and everything else, this mass migration has defined the world we live in very much today. And the policies that were then enacted also do. Here's a chart of the Confederate Monuments. So this period here is the end of the Civil War, this sort of 1915, in this zone here, 1910, where you're starting to see this mass migration. The migration is happening. The split between us and them is getting greater. The Birth of a Nation comes in at this point. Gone with the Wind. The fact that it was okay culturally to say this group of people is dangerous and other. And really that belief has been one of the most cancerous elements of our history, and shameful, quite shameful history. This book, which is absolutely required reading for anyone interested in this topic, by Richard Rothstein, and just look him up. He has videos online, they're short videos. Look him up if you're interested in this topic. And his premise is that this didn't happen by accident, which would be de facto segregation. De facto segregation is to say that it was by accident and private. He actually makes a pretty strong and very compelling argument to say it's de jure, which is actually condoned by the government, and that the policies were unconstitutional. And he goes as far as saying that we have an obligation to cure it. I agree with that. We created a system that was systemic at all levels, federal and local. It was also private. It was in all settings. And this has set up the situation we're in today. The first main move was in 1934 with the New Deal. And now with all of these policies, you're going to have positive and negative. The New Deal arguably pulled us out of the Great Depression. It allowed white Americans on the path to home ownership and accumulation of wealth. The program itself actually was great. The problem with this program was that it excluded people of color. Housing was in the Great Depression was actually one of the things that led to the problem. And so FDR came in with the New Deal and said, okay, we're going to create mortgages. This was the first time we had mortgages. So they introduced the 30-year mortgage with a low fixed rate, which allowed people to enter into safe home ownership. You could build equity. You could move that equity to different houses. It was insured. It was affordable to enter into, and it was affordable to live with. What happened was, for the first time, they said, okay, well, if we're giving these mortgages and we're insuring them, we have to decide how to assess the risk, which on one hand is a reasonable point to make. So this is the problem with this history. It's very slippery. On one hand, the points made were reasonable, but they were used in a very negative and dangerous way. So of course, if you were giving money to someone, you would assess risk. The problem was they assessed risk by the color of someone's skin. That's not a determination of risk. That is based on these fears. It's the birth of a nation, of this sort of gone with the wind other, of this feeling in our society at the time that just because somebody was other, and this is a leftover from slavery where this society owned other humans, and to justify that, you have to say they're other. That was carried forward into this. So when we said, okay, how do we assess risk? They went into communities and they redlined them. It was called redlining, where in this case, the red communities were hazardous, that the Negroes, the low income immigrants lived. Next up from that were the yellow, which would be declining. This is South Bend, where I live today. The declining neighborhoods, which were in danger of becoming the red neighborhoods. The blue was the next step up and green was the best, all white, non-Jewish. This is how they ranked everyone, and your mortgage depended on this. You could get a mortgage in the blue and the green, you could not get a mortgage in the red, and you had to fight for a mortgage in the yellow. And immediately what this did was cut entire groups of people based on the color of their skin and their nation of origin out of the American dream, out of the 30-year mortgage. Go online if you're interested in this, a resource. It's called Mapping Inequality. It's a joint venture between several universities. It's a website. You can click each of these little bubbles and it will take you to your city. You can also search cities. And so, yes, if you're giving money to somebody, you need to assess risk, but it's outrageous to do it on this basis. But what this did was set in motion a series of events which were near impossible to pull back. So at the same time, the Public Works Administration was building the first housing projects. Now, actually, housing projects didn't used to be segregated, and they didn't used to be only for people with no means or very low means. They were meant to just help people along. These programs of the 30s were meant to pull us out of the Depression. And this poster, which shows many of the great things that were happening, very much like the FHA loans, were also, on the flip side, the beginning of what we know to be the housing projects and the segregation. Lyndon Baines Johnson in Austin, Texas, started the housing authority there and came up with the thought, whether he did or within a group, led the first segregation in Austin, which was really one of the first ones nationwide. Actually demolished a park that was built in 1905 called Emancipation Park, with the plan, it was in East Austin, the plan to move all of the African-American community to that area. They did this, they reinforced it by taking down schools and libraries, closing them, making it impossible to live outside of that area. So now we have this concentrated neighborhoods and areas by literally to the block in some cases, been redlined and said, no, you can't get a loan if you're in this area. Now there's this effort to force entire populations into these areas. So if you weren't in it, they're going to try and get you into it. This has a snowballing effect across the country and across the economy. In parallel to this, the new communities were being built, with Levittown starting out being the most famous, but all over. And this lingers to today. Deed restrictions, and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to come back to this point quite a bit. Deed restrictions, which essentially said, okay, anyone can come in for your FHA loan, but by the way, you have to be white. And once you buy it, you can't sell to anyone else. This is where, in Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, he really successfully makes the point that this is where the federal government did support these policies. While Levittown was a private project, it was supported and only made possible by the FHA loans. These loans were what allowed these homes to be built. And so while it was private, it was also supported by a federal program. So this is federally sanctioned discrimination. And essentially, the bottom line of it is, if you were white, you got a 30-year mortgage with no money down, or especially when it came to post-war with the Veterans Administration, they had no money down, low interest, and it was insured. And the importance of an insured loan is really key here. Anyone today that has a mortgage, I can sell my home and keep the equity that's in it and move to someplace else. If you were Black middle-class vet with the exact same resume and portfolio, you would not be able to get this insured loan. You would have a large down payment, you would pay higher interest, and it would be uninsured. And we're going to talk about that a little more, about the problems with the uninsured loans, which meant you were stuck in your house. And so if the neighborhood was coming down around you, turning into a slum, you were trapped in it. And therefore your investment was disintegrated. So here we are in slums. So these redlined communities that were very clearly marked out on the map were not only, you're not allowed to get a loan now in this because it's deemed risky, The cities at this exact same time, nationwide, stopped giving resources. So garbage collection would be slowed down. The water, if you've heard about the Flint, Michigan water crisis, that is just one of thousands across the nation. Water was unsafe. Services were pulled back. The buildings are falling into disrepair. You have overcrowding because people weren't allowed to live other places. So you have this snowballing effect. And yes, crime increased. These slums were designed by policy and action. And the result was what you would imagine. The people that were trapped there, by the way, didn't want to live there either, but they were trapped into it. Then you have a tactic called blockbusting, where you would have in these yellow neighborhoods, the ones that are declining, speculators would sell to African-American families marked up, because the limits of where they were able to buy, when they were able to get out of a red line district, they would pay extra to do so. Then they would push through this narrative that the neighborhood's going down. Again, remembering that the slum was created by policy and by pulling out resources, saying no more garbage collection, putting in toxic use facilities that white people didn't want in their communities, putting them in the Black communities. And now whites start fleeing. We have white flight because they can go to the suburbs, which again, the Black families are not allowed to move into by deed restriction. And you have white families leave, they sell at a loss, and just to get out because they're afraid that if they don't leave now, this is going to come back on them. More Black families are sold to at a higher rate, and the speculators and the real estate agents are the ones winning. Everybody else is losing, and no one stopped it. If a few of the real estate agents had had their license suspended for this behavior, they might have stopped, but they were encouraged. So now we have redline communities, which are actually quite financially good investments for those that are purchasing because they've made so much money off of it. Slumlords pack people into homes because there's so few places they can live. They can actually make more money. They could at the time. These landlords make more money on these properties because they don't have to put anything into them. They can allow them to just completely fall to disrepair. And we have the system, Blacks trapped while whites flee. They're trapped in these communities with the contract loans as opposed to the FHA backed and insured loans. And so even as the community around them, those that were able to purchase and paid more for it, they can't leave because the community around them is crumbling into a slum, and they can't leave or they will lose their entire investment because they haven't built equity. They've just given cash. You know, the few people that were able to get out were absolutely terrorized. Cicero, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, had a major riot. It was condoned by the police. They actually were ushers, this family that a white landlord rented to a Black family. And the only people charged after a riot that ended up burning down the property were the landlord, the family, the real estate agents, and their lawyers. The victims were the only ones that ended up being indicted. And this sends a message to anyone that's now trying to get out of these borderline neighborhoods or the red line neighborhoods. Anyone that has the opportunity to maybe get out, don't. And so now we have this sort of doubling down. And this is where it's systemic, when you sort of hear the word systemic racism, because it cut through all aspects of society, but essentially it was the mob of this fear, going back to the Birth of a Nation movie, Gone with the Wind. These people are other, they're dangerous. And the sad irony is the people doing the burning down here were not the Black families. They were the victims of mob mentality and a society that allowed this to happen. So we keep going forward, and now we finally have some relief with the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It was the third major civil rights act following just the Civil Rights Act and the Voters' Right Act. The problem is, by this point, it was too late. And it also wasn't actually adhered to, because the racist and the systemic racism built into our housing market and society is slippery. It just keeps shifting. It keeps shifting. It keeps happening to today. And it still is documented that it still happens today. So while in 1968, the worst of the worst was stopped, one, the damage had been done. And two, the creation of new ways to approach the same set of racist policies, the tactics changed. This is a case study from University of Oklahoma has done an amazing job putting a website together of mapping urban renewal. So on top of red line districts. So this is Minneapolis. Here, the red line, the declining, the next step up. There's no green ones in this screenshot. This is what these neighborhoods looked like in the 50s. And if you look, this is downtown. And these, what we would consider today, really nice urban fabric. If you imagine the prime place, if you could live anywhere near a downtown, is in this first neighborhood right next to the downtown area, walkable communities, nice sized blocks. So all of this, considering looking between these two, is there any difference in this block and this block? No, there's no difference. There's no difference in the buildings. There's no difference. Redlining is now not legal because it's been cut off, keeping in mind that 30 years on, these would have fallen into disrepair. And now urban renewal comes in and blasts out the fabric and puts in the freeways. Freeways actually wove through cities to go around the desirable neighborhoods and cut through the undesirable neighborhoods, therefore really sort of cleaning people out. This community here, if it existed today, imagine if the resources hadn't been pulled, if we hadn't fallen into, the neighborhoods hadn't fallen into disrepair, if people were allowed to get proper mortgages, what would the value of this be? And think about that. What would the value be that was stolen? And it was stolen and then turned into freeway. So here's the legacy. Here's where we've come. This actually is an article from Friday that 400 billion in tax revenue can be attributed to the loss that has come from housing discrimination. Think about that. $400 billion in tax revenue. We can see it in another way. We have both an income disparity as well as a wealth gap. And the wealth gap can almost completely be tracked back to the housing. If your grandparents owned a home, there's a chance that you do. If your grandparents were locked out of owning a home, there's less of a chance that you do. And we look back at that and we say we've lost generations because of this. We've lost generations because we've excluded people from viably working and living. I mean, what is more fundamental to humanity than food and shelter? I haven't touched on work discrimination in this talk. That's another topic, and we could do an equivalent talk of that. And Rothstein actually talks about that in his book. The recession, the 2008 downturn, disproportionately impacted minority communities, specifically about Black communities. That's showing here is that while white communities have lost, they've started to gain back. And while Black lost, they had less to lose. It's not actually come back up. Well, this was 2013, but essentially modern times, minorities are more likely to be turned down for a loan. And in the research that goes into this, it actually takes equivalent people. So two people, equivalent resume, equivalent income. The white is more likely to get the loan and the minority, especially Blacks, are not. So this is still happening. This is deeply prevalent in all society. And then again, another chart showing the same. This is from the Pew Research Center. And then not only is it more difficult, but in most cases, Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to pay higher mortgage rates. They're deemed to be riskier. I don't have a slide in here. There was ABC just did an investigative report on housing appraisals where they were documenting that African-American households get lower appraisals for the same home. This is everywhere still. This is happening now. This is happening today. Not only are the results of this systemic racism impacting where people are today, it's actively still happening. And in health impacts, if you're living in one of these communities, you're more likely to have lead paint there. You're more likely to have pollutants. The slum conditions, which have been created for the reasons we've already discussed, lead to more asthma, childhood cancers, and heart disease, which then make it difficult to fight off things like COVID. So here we are, we've created the system where people trapped in these communities have less favorable health outcomes. We're seeing that in absolutely real time in the current disaster, in the current pandemic. That leads also into the achievement gap at school, where if you haven't slept at night because you've been coughing because of asthma, how well are you going to study the next day? Or what if you're worried about eviction? You don't know where you're going to live that night. Are you going to pay attention in science class? This is another book, another reading assignment for you, Evicted by Matthew Desmond. It unpacks both the systemic side of this in African-American community in Milwaukee, as well as in a white trailer park in Milwaukee, and unpacks how people got there, how they're trapped in it. He went and lived in these communities and met people and saw what the daily life was. And one of his big points was, how do you study in school if you don't know where you're going to sleep at night? And then imagine the teacher that's teaching in that school has 30 of these kids. One didn't eat, one had asthma. How is the performance of that school, on top of the fact that schools are funded by property taxes, and when the property taxes are down, you have less funding for the schools. Good schools raise property taxes, and so it's cyclical. If you live in a community with great schools, your property taxes are supporting that, and it's drawing in more investment. How do you take a teacher in an overcrowded classroom where the kids aren't able to focus and expect good outcomes? And you can see where the achievement gap is. How can you get ahead when that's the reality? I'm not going to get into policing. I'm going to mention it here, but this obviously has ties to it. We overly police communities. We've created slums, and then we wonder why there are problems in those communities, why there's higher crime. And at the same time, we over-police. Another resource to watch is The 13th. It's a Netflix documentary on the prison system. I mean, if you consider too, the crack epidemic of the 80s versus the opioid epidemic now, an entire generation is lost to the prison system, and the other one, we call it a health crisis. One is a criminal crisis if it's for the Black side, one is a health crisis if it's for the white side. And all of this relates back to housing. If we had safer communities where people could build equity, they were not trapped out, if we had the city services that were in these communities, pressure would be released on it. Here's the environmental legacy of redlining. And here I'm doing redlining sort of in quotes because now we're talking about this system, it's the systemic racism. So this is Richmond, and this is a New York Times. They have shown where the red areas here, these were the redlined communities. This is tree cover across the city, pavement, and the heat index in the summer, which then ticks on all of the boxes of health and property values, just quality of life that you would have in a community when there's no trees. So this touches everything. There's one hopeful element that comes of this, showing the heat index across most US major cities over time, how that is played out. And you're seeing now groups that are looking at environmental racism and trying to fix it. This is a gentleman in Richmond, Virginia, who's working on it and lowering the heat index. There's initiatives out in Denver. So at least there is some positive things coming from this, but it starts with an awareness of where it came from. It starts with an understanding that these were redlined neighborhoods that are having this after effect, and then going in and looking for solutions. This is where the narrative converges. So this is DPZ. It's the famous DPZ, Duane-Platter-Zyberk diagram showing a traditional neighborhood compared to a conventional suburban sprawl. Here's the irony. This, if you were redlining, and if you look at the neighborhoods that were redlined, this, which is what the new urbanists are proposing we build, is what would have been cut out. And this, the Levittown side, is what we're proposing not to do. But the codes that put them in place, the codes that exist today that new urbanists have been fighting against in cities nationwide, are the racist leftovers and the policies that were left behind by the FHA loans. Of all of these policies that were put in place for a very specific reason, have now backfired on the communities that were intended to be privileged by those same policies. And take a second with that. If you think about it, like, this is what we want to build. We want to build walkable communities where people can live in a house. It can still be a single family house. It can still be suburban, and walk to work walk to shops, have their kids walk to schools, because it's been shown actually that the outcomes, if you live in a community like this, in terms of economy, in terms of health, in terms of all of the things that we track, and even home value in communities that are invested in like this, are better than the outcomes of the communities where you're trapped in a car and everything is single use. And when the economy hits one sector, an entire community collapses. If you consider the irony that the exact policies that were put in place to systematically and successfully exclude entire races out of our economy and out of our society, that these policies were put in place to exclude, have backfired, and now are unsustainable and have created an infrastructure crisis, a housing crisis, a retail apocalypse. The irony of it is really quite extraordinary, is that all of the things that as new urbanists we fight against are the racist policies that were put in place to exclude. We don't call that to light, and we need to. We need to call to light that the exact policies that were intended to privilege have absolutely done the opposite. So more reading assignments. Look up Strong Towns, go to their website and get the book, Strong Towns, The Bottom-Up Revolution. He will unpack why the suburban sprawl system, which was again put in place because of redlining, Levittown-esque communities and urban renewal, is financially completely unviable. If we look at almost every community nationwide, everybody's having an economic crisis, a tax crisis, because we can't support our infrastructure. Consider where that infrastructure came from. But the next time you're sitting on sort of a spaghetti highway somewhere directly outside of downtown, consider that most likely directly underneath you at some point was a pretty fantastic community that was disinvested in, turned into a slum, and then raised for a freeway. A freeway, by the way, that we can't afford to pay for. And housing that would be absolutely welcome today, because if it had been continued to invest in it, if we'd continued to support these communities, they wouldn't have fallen into disrepair, and we would have had an amazing housing stock that was walkable near downtowns, and we would have had entire communities of people that were still actively part of our economy. Beyond that, and I'm made sure to find articles before COVID, because while we are hitting a retail apocalypse now, we were using the word apocalypse and meltdown before COVID, it's at a scale we've never seen. And it's not new to COVID. It's not new because of where we are today. It's definitely magnified and worse. But the way we build and support retail in this country is absolutely unsustainable. And part of that is a direct result of how we segregated retail out of communities. This was part of the GI Bill, which was happening at the same time as Levittown and all of these early suburban neighborhoods were being built. The failure of our retail is a direct result of racist housing policy. And sit with that for a second, if you think about it. There's a new book. The first book was Retrofitting Suburbia, but a brand new book out now by June Williamson, Ellen Dunham Jones. Excellent book looking at how we fix these failing malls, failing sprawl, and they have case studies showing it, showing how to get this right and how to fix these issues. But understand that the issues were born out of policies to divide, and they backfired. The system that was put in place to disenfranchise, and successfully so, but also absolutely collapsed on itself. And now the only solution is to build the very stuff that we made illegal. Anyone minimum wage or average income can afford to purchase is not in keeping with the cost to build and resale cost. We have a supply and demand issue. There's a gap. It is now prevalent at almost all price levels, except the very high end, which is thriving because that's the only place a developer can make a decent margin. So they just keep pumping out condos. And much of this is a direct result of racist housing policy that has backfired on the very communities that it was intended to privilege. Part of this is because of exclusionary zoning. So the Levittowns said, okay, we're just going to build our little houses, while over time it's been made illegal to separate out who can live there. the squishiness of our housing system and our codes has allowed us to continue to exclude through what is built. And this is where, when I was working with James Hardy, we went to Texas and we were fighting against exclusionary materials. So they would say, well, we can only have brick here. And that was specifically to keep others out. And all of these codes, they're imploding on themselves. So we're now looking nationwide and seeing cities come up and say, okay, we're not going to, only say single family housing can be here. Another reading assignment for you is Dan Froehlich's Missing Middle Housing, which shows you how to add density back in a way that's invisible, in a way that works with the communities, is seamless in them. And so there are solutions. The way we used to build, ironically, the very communities that we redlined and said, no, these communities are unsafe, are the exact models that we need to look to save all of housing. So not only do we need to go back, we need to apologize and acknowledge and find solutions for the people that we disenfranchised, but use those models to save the other side, which is this crumbling infrastructure and systemic housing crisis. Of course, you have NIMBYs that come out and freak out. Anytime someone talks about affordable housing, you go to communities where they'll say, we need affordable housing, but then they come back and say, but don't build it here. And so you get this, NIMBY being not in my backyard, fighting against any change. And partially, the irony of that is that they imagine change to be horrible. And for good reason, because the exact same tactics that we as a society use to exclude are the ones that they think we would put back in their communities. And I put this up as a distinction between lowercase and uppercase affordable housing, because what is affordable housing? Affordable housing is both the subsidized, that's the uppercase, but it's also just a house that you can afford, which is the lowercase. And this is where we're looking at our communities and we're saying we need affordable housing. We need to be able to afford where we live. Of course, this is the thought bubble that comes up, is the projects, the dilapidated houses, the Pruitt-Igos or the Cabrini Greens. Here again is the irony. When you have people coming out in suburban communities, red hot mad about the idea of affordable housing, this is what's in their thought bubble. And the irony is that these are the tools that were used to exclude. And now they're coming back and saying, no, we don't want them. And it's the same tools that were used to privilege that people think are affordable housing, when the reality is that it's the opposite, that we could actually use the tools of the very places that we disenfranchised to fix the issues that we have on the suburban side. The people that have benefited from systemic racist policies now think that those policies are, and in some cases they are because our toolkit of design is very limited, partially by the policies that were put in place. So no, I don't think this is what we should build anywhere. And I'm pretty sure that no one does. The people that live in this, that have been forced to live in this, don't want this. And so we look at this and we say, well, we don't want affordable housing. Well, no, of course you don't. We also need to be careful not to build this garbage, which I could give an entire talk and full-on rant about this stuff, which is the modernist architects experimenting on the poor and dropping in ridiculous buildings that ignore the fact that water falls from the sky and goes to the ground and that Louisiana is humid. We have to build buildings that are, one, based on building science, two, on climate, and three, respectful of the places that they're in and that are trying to be for people, not experimentation as a portfolio piece. So this is not what we would define as affordable housing, but this is all of this is affordable housing. The top is a HUD Hope 6 project that Torty Gallis did out in Seattle. This is FEMA housing that I worked on, the Katrina cottages in Louisiana, and more recently, wildfire disaster housing with Habitat for Humanity in Santa Rosa, California. So I'd like to live in or next to any of these. I'd be very proud to live near all of them. And it comes down to design. So when we try and fix the affordable housing crisis, if we look back at the models that we've made illegal through racist policy, we actually find the solutions that fixes both the communities that we've disenfranchised and the communities that we were supposedly privileging. And we could deal with quite a few of these NIMBY problems by fixing with design. So where do we go from here? We need to start by challenging our implicit bias. No, affordable housing doesn't bring crime. In the summer months, in coastal communities, both shark attacks and ice cream sales go up. The sharks are not eating the ice cream. It's good weather. So when we look at the crime in the communities that are dilapidated communities because of the systemic racism and the systemic housing policies that we have put in place, they have resulted in higher crime. These are separate things. We have to separate correlation and causation and stop villainizing others as sort of us and them. But I'm pretty sure if the policy had been reversed, we would have the exact same outcomes with white communities trapped in the same circumstances. So we have to be very careful here to unpack why communities have crime and look to the root cause as opposed to the individuals that are in them. This is another one you see, oh, but I worked hard and why don't they make better decisions? Well, if you're trapped on this bottom line with the water coming out of your faucet that looks like this, over policing, and a community where your schools are failing and the kids that are going to school are exhausted, the outcomes are going to be where you would imagine. But if you've been given affirmative action, if you will, the ability to live with affordable housing, and again, this was affordable subsidized housing because the loans were insured, in places where you have access to food, you don't live in a food desert, and your kids can go to school and study and learn and then go to college, of course, you're going to have more advantages because it's easier and there are fewer roadblocks. So yes, people can overcome and get out of this, but there's a lot more hurdles. So no, it's not about individual choice. It's about setting up communities to succeed, entire communities, not individuals. With COVID, I heard really when it came about early on, everyone was saying, well, we're all in the same storm. No, we're not. We're not. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And this is something that is both for COVID and with the overall economy. We're all in it together, but we're not, because some of us have a much easier way to go with it. And we need to own that. We need to own and understand it. Before COVID, 30% of Americans were housing and or food insecure. We have a system that was designed to exclude some and has imploded on itself and failed. And now we have an economy that is absolutely not working. It's a house of cards. And it's become absolutely obvious in this world where our first responders, the people that have the lowest paying jobs, our teachers, our nurses, people that are delivering our food are absolutely at risk. Minorities that have been disenfranchised through all of the previous slides. And if we think about the sort of the issues of getting over this sort of this bias in our minds, we're also, what are we leaving on the table? What inventions haven't been invented? Could the cure of COVID been faster if the scientist didn't have asthma and not make it to college? What companies haven't been started? What books haven't been written because we have excluded amazing people from our economy and from our society? And the fix starts with acknowledging it and having a will to change, recognizing the history and overcoming the fear to win hearts and minds. We need to immediately stop the policies and the practices that are perpetuating this today and enforce that we do actually have laws that are, to the word, right, but then they allow these other policies to exist, exclusionary zoning, masonry requirements instead of a performance requirement. There are ways of coding in racism, and there are ways of excluding through codes, and there are ways of coding in performance that allow you to build communities that are more resilient for all. We need to finance it. That is not going to be easy to afford, but at the same time, if we don't do this, not only is it morally a problem, but we don't have a future without everybody. We're in a fragile state, and we need everybody to equally participate to get us out of this. And when we do, we can hopefully find some more equitable housing solutions. This was the slide I started with early on, and which basically the we can do better slide. I'll sort of wrap here with, we need to learn the history of how we've gotten to where we are, acknowledge it, and call it out, and then immediately get on to fixing it. You know, we fight against individual policies, but when you look at it in a systemic way, it's absolutely heartbreaking what we have allowed to happen and continue to happen. We can do better. It's who we are. It's who we are as a nation and as humans to do better. So I thank you for your time today and for the opportunity to present. And I look forward to any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you so much, Marianne, for a really important and insightful conversation today. And I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the questions we've already got in. Our first one says, this was an excellent, uncomfortable, and thought-provoking presentation. How straightforward did you find it to carry out the background research? Was all this information readily available in the public domain, or was there anything that you found that was particularly surprising?
I find it also very uncomfortable, and I've been upset, I mean, to the point of tears at one point when I was watching one of the videos of absolutely like, how did I not know this? And shameful. I'm ashamed. It's all out there in plain sight. That's why throughout the talk, I put the resources in there, and it's just all there. I mean, it is so easy to find and see all of it. And then when you connect the dots with it and start looking at how the pieces go together, then it becomes more fascinating. Just straight up start with Color of Law, read Sundown Towns and The Great Migration. I haven't made it all the way through. They're pretty thick, but you can get a sense of them pretty early on. Watch the videos from each of those authors. Just look up the authors and there will be endless numbers of podcasts and videos. And then anytime a new phrase sort of pops up, search those phrases. So the Mapping Inequality, the Redlining website, the information that you find, sadly, there's a shocking amount of information. It's just, we don't talk about it. It's hiding in plain sight.
And our next question comes in. We need to build traditional housing for people, in parentheses, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who we owe a debt of $500 billion to. As a systemic problem, I wonder how many traditional building types there are that aren't just Western/Euroclassical.
If you look at the tradition of thousands of years of building, you have all over this world amazing resources and precedent to look to. We happen to be in the US. The simplest way to build is build a box and put a sloped roof on it and put some nice proportioned windows in, and ideally a way to sit outside. That's why I go to traditional form, because it's built on principles of how you would simply build. Of course, it's never so simple these days, but yeah, I mean, there's precedent, and we should be looking to regional precedent. We should be looking to any precedent that builds places for people and not experimenting. That's why the Brad Pitt stuff is so offensive. If we just build great urban fabric with single family homes or duplexes, or looking at the missing middle housing, if you look at great places that just feel right, they're usually really simple buildings.
The next question that comes in asks, have you been able to address homelessness in your work with affordable housing?
I personally haven't worked on homeless specific issues because my wheelhouse is disaster rebuilding. I have a lane that I'm kind of in. There are amazing right now programs for little tiny houses and homeless shacks, which are really taking off. And the idea being within the homeless communities that you just need to get people in shelter before you give a long list of things about how they should live, and get them off the street and get that piece in place. You see, especially on the West Coast, in California and in Portland, new programs for accessory dwelling units. And there's multiple different versions of it. Sometimes the house is given to the homeowner with the agreement that for 5 years they rent to someone that's homeless or a homeless family. And then after 5 years, they get it at a discount or they get it free. There's different versions of it. But what that's doing is a win-win, because a family gets an accessory dwelling unit, another family gets a house for, you know, the availability of housing for 5 years. We're adding housing units in. So there's many ways to approach it, but it's a kind of an all hands on deck. When you have a toolkit of traditional building types, of missing middle housing types, you have a lot of ways of meeting those needs that we haven't been allowed to build because of exclusionary zoning, that is illegal to build a lot of these things. As these zoning codes are stripped back, then we can actually address these issues that have grown because we haven't had the full set of tools available.
Our next question comes in from Monique, who says, I very much enjoyed the presentation. Can you expand on why shopping malls were created, moving shopping out of neighborhoods?
Yeah, so it was part of the GI Bill. That was the first time it happened. And it was this idea of, at the time, of course, if the shopping mall is just around the corner from the housing, you wouldn't see it as where it has grown to this sort of crippling, now you get on the freeway to go shopping, you get on the freeway in some places to go to the grocery store. At the time, I think that they couldn't have imagined how poorly it would have built out. The codes, though, were set to protect the sort of the white families from what they saw as the sort of the other and the dangerous communities, which then architecture and urbanism got lumped into that. And the policies became series of codes and events where suddenly now housing and retail and office, everything's separated out. At the same time, you have the car is now a major thing. Ford Motor Company is out, putting up billboards everywhere. And the American dream is to hop in your car and go just down the street and you're fine, because that was before the idea of gridlock. And we didn't see how this would crumble. I would imagine that if you went back and talked to the people that were making those codes then, put them in a time machine and dropped them into sort of Houston, 6 p.m. on a non-COVID day, I'm pretty sure that they would not want their policies carried forward. But then when you add the layer of what's not said in that policy, you wonder if they would have. We've been, as new urbanists, fighting against these policies because they failed. But when we add the layer of because they were racist, it changes the dialogue pretty substantially. I've always said, well, I wonder what they would think. And well, maybe they'd still be happy with it because it worked. And so who knows? I mean, I don't mean to sort of speak ill of people I've never met. I don't know their intentions, but I do know the results. And I do know why now some of these things happened. And we can't separate those two. The policies failed, but they also succeeded in what they were trying to do. And if we don't marry those two narratives together, we can never get out of this.
Austin asks, do you have a compilation of policies that you feel need to be changed or pursued?
We need to start with the all of the exclusionary zoning. Actually, Dan Perolick did a nice blog posting a month or so ago on missing middle housing of how to successfully get rid of exclusionary zoning. Because the problem is we've lost the language and we've lost how to do these things. So the NIMBYs come out because they really think when you add density, it's going to be Pruitt-Igoe landing next door. I mean, it's just like, God, no one wants that. No one wants that. But we've also lost the toolkit because then you get people like the make it right junk that lands in. And so we do need to protect from some things. We need to protect from completely ridiculous stuff. By no way, I think we should code against style. Like, I do think that should be at the market level, that we get rid of style. I absolutely do not believe in coding style, but I do believe in coding performance. And I do believe in allowing a mix of uses and doing it in a way that is proven to be successful. And if we don't, and we just let everything be, it'll backfire even worse, because people will put ridiculous stuff in and then they'll say, well, no, mixed use is bad. It's like, no, well, that mixed use is bad. Of course it's bad, because we didn't look at how to actually build. So look up, Dan Perolick has a really good blog posting on how to properly code for missing middle and get rid of exclusionary zoning. That's a big one, is getting rid of that. We need to support housing vouchers and allow people to move, add more vouchers, which incentivizes development. The only way to successfully do this, it has to be both public at the local, county, and national level, federal level. It needs to be private industry needs to participate, and it also needs to be nonprofit. We need all of these pieces to come together, and for each of them to do the pieces they're good at. The federal government is really good at writing checks, so they should write checks, but stay out of some of the building. They should incentivize. The solution really needs to be all hands on deck and everybody working at it together. I mean, the biggest issue isn't policy, because the minute as a collective society, we decide we want to fix this, we will. At the moment, we're still fighting for whether we should, or whether it's something that matters, or whether some of us have been privileged over others. We're still not owning and understanding the system that got us here. And until that happens, no policy matters. No policy matters until hearts and minds are won over, and before we acknowledge what has happened and why it's happened and how it has been a negative impact, not only for the people that have been on the receiving end, but the people that were privileged by it. And until that happens, no policy matters. Because of the slippery nature of it, we can put all the policy in place that you want, but as long as society says it's okay to discriminate and it's okay that we did, nothing matters. Nothing will stop it. When society says this was horrible what happened and we need to stop it from continuing to happen, then we have a chance of putting policy in place.
The next question we'll be looking at comes from Katie, who asks, how does the availability of standardized materials and the dominance of stick-built or wood frame construction prevent more quality in affordable housing that needs to be built in the future? For example, the value engineering of developers today doesn't seem to incentivize building of affordable housing. How could this obstacle be overcome?
COVID has made that worse because material is skyrocketing. So we have a labor shortage, and now we have a material shortage. And hopefully the material piece can come into play, but material prices never seem to go down. So I doubt that. There is optimization that can come. We need to incentivize smaller development. The Incremental Development Alliance or Association are fantastic. Look them up. They can help because they go into the properties that are left over that people don't want, and they build small things. You don't have to have the big infrastructure. They're not doing the giant parking decks, which make things more expensive. So smaller development is key. The problem is it comes down to margins. If you're in business as a developer, would you rather have a large margin or small margin? You know, you're in business. So if you're taking investment from somebody else and you're using somebody else's money to build your building, do they want a small return or a large return? So if you have a market for luxury condos, it's naturally where people are going to end up. This is why COVID could help, because the luxury condo market may, you know, in some cases may be okay still. I mean, the top will always stay at the top, but because of the need for more housing and single family housing now, there could be opportunity for a wider range of people building, and that is always good when you have a wider range. Off-site, I'm fascinated by and continue to explore different off-site and systems-built solutions. But in the end, we're stick building in our Panama City, Florida project right now because the industry is so resistant to it that the prices were better to stick build, and we want our returns. So we're stick building right now, even though we would prefer not to. But at the moment, stick building still is the way to go. But it's all hands on deck. It's anything in the toolkit that works.
The last question I think is a good one to end on comes in from Terrence, who says, tremendous presentation. I'm part of my state's Government Affairs Committee of Home Builders Association. How do we get this information to our group and to government leaders?
Read up, become an expert, and share it. That's really all we can do. We need to be an engaged citizenry. We need, in conversations about these things, to know the history. We need to learn civics. We need to be part of the solution. And it really comes down to that. This has to be, at a societal level, a choice. And the only choice that we have is to say we can do better because we know what happened and we know that there are better options. So read up on all of these things and become the expert and be able to talk to it, to be able to see why some of this has happened and be the voice of it. And it's on all of us to do that. I mean, that's who we are as a nation, is we strive for better, but we strive for better by understanding that it has not always been great. And that's the key to any of this, is to educate ourselves and allow ourselves to grow.
Well, thank you, Marianne. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and we really appreciate your presentation and everyone who's attended today and sent in questions. And I'll hand things over briefly to Edith Platten, the ICAA's Director of Education, for a few quick closing remarks.
Thank you all for tuning in today, and I hope you have a great day wherever you are. And thank you, Marianne and Julie, for moderating us at the end for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.